You said only okay and left. No explanation, no defense, no reaction. They expected tears. They expected anger. They expected some attempt to convince them otherwise. But they received emptiness, and that emptiness destroyed them more than any argument could have. Most people don't understand what just happened. They interpret your silence as surrender. They read your departure as defeat. They assume that someone who doesn't fight back must lack the strength to resist. This interpretation reveals everything about where they're operating from. It exposes their fundamental misunderstanding about where power actually lives. The person who argues is still negotiating. The person who defends is still invested. The person who explains is still seeking permission to be understood. All of these responses maintain the connection. They keep the other person relevant. They validate the premise that this conversation matters enough to continue. Your okay did something entirely different. It closed the file, not because it didn't hurt, not because you had nothing to say, but because saying anything would have cost more than walking away. This isn't emotional coldness. It's economic clarity about where your energy belongs. You already possess something most people spend years desperately pursuing: internal completeness. You don't need to win arguments because you don't need to be understood. You don't need the last word because you're not building your identity from external confirmation. Your sense of self doesn't depend on someone else's agreement or acknowledgement. This creates a specific kind of psychological freedom. When you don't need validation, you can't be controlled through its withdrawal. When you don't need approval, you can't be manipulated through its promise. When you don't need connection, you can't be held hostage by the threat of its absence. You didn't walk away to punish them. You didn't leave to demonstrate superiority. You didn't deploy strategic silence to win. You walked away because there was genuinely nothing left to negotiate. The calculation had already been completed. The decision had already been made. The emotional investment had already been withdrawn. The okay was simply the final notification that the door had closed. This confuses people who operate from scarcity. To someone who needs relationships, needs recognition, needs constant proof that they matter, your departure without reaction looks incomprehensible. It violates their understanding of how conflict works. Arguments are supposed to have escalation. Disagreements are supposed to generate heat. Someone is supposed to care enough to fight back, but you understand something they don't. Caring and fighting aren't the same thing. You can care deeply about something and still recognize that engaging won't change it. You can feel hurt and still understand that defending yourself to someone who's already decided won't restore anything worth restoring. You can value what existed and simultaneously acknowledge that explaining yourself to someone who refuses to listen is throwing resources into a vacuum. What looks like a weak response on the surface, defending yourself, explaining your position, counter-attacking, all of these behaviors reveal the same underlying condition: the belief that if you perform correctly, the other person will understand. The assumption that their perception matters enough to correct. The operation from a premise that being right will generate the recognition you're seeking. It won't. People who have decided don't need more information. They need their conclusion confirmed. Any response you give simply becomes new evidence for the story they've already written. You recognized this. That's why you said, okay. Your response acknowledged reality without bitterness. It accepted that some battles aren't worth the cost of participation. Not because you'd lose, but because winning would require you to become someone you're not willing to be. It would require you to stay in a conversation that has no destination. It would require you to keep negotiating with someone who's not actually listening. Your departure after okay created a specific kind of psychological void for them. They lost closure. They didn't get the satisfaction of your reaction. They didn't get confirmation that they hurt you. They didn't get the escalation that would justify their position. They didn't get the defense that would let them attack further. They got nothing, and nothing is much harder to process than conflict. Conflict provides structure. It creates roles. It generates energy. It confirms that both people still matter to each other, even if that mattering takes the form of anger. Your silence removed all of that. It left them with only themselves and the discomfort of their own actions, without your participation to validate them. This wasn't manipulation. It wasn't a tactical move designed to hurt more effectively. It was simply the natural consequence of understanding something fundamental. Your energy is finite. Your attention is limited. Your emotional capacity is a resource that doesn't regenerate by being spent on people who refuse to hear you. Every minute you spend defending yourself to someone who's already decided is a minute stolen from the life you could be building instead. You've already built that life. You already have peace. You already have internal stability. You already know who you are without needing external mirrors to confirm it. This means you have something most people never achieve: the ability to let others be wrong about you without needing to correct the record. You didn't develop this kind of strength by trying to appear detached. You didn't perform your way into genuine indifference. Your okay carried weight because it came from actual abundance. Your life is rich enough that the drama becomes small by comparison. Your sense of self is solid enough that someone else's judgment doesn't create structural damage. Your emotional economy is sound enough that you genuinely can't afford to invest in losing battles. This developed through practice in smaller moments. The comments you didn't respond to, the judgment you didn't correct, the misunderstanding you let stand because explaining wouldn't change anything and silence cost you nothing. Each time you chose not to engage, you strengthened the neural pathway that recognizes engagement as optional rather than mandatory. The paradox is that the less you need to respond, the more respect you generate. Not because silence is inherently powerful, but because your silence from a position of strength communicates something words never could. You have better things to do than prove yourself to people who've already made up their minds. Your life is too valuable to spend defending it to an audience that's watching for entertainment rather than understanding. Actions build respect. Words have never convinced anyone who decided not to listen. When you said okay and walked away, you weren't giving up. You were choosing your battles with the precision of someone who understands that energy spent here is energy stolen from there. You made the calculation that your peace matters more than being understood by someone who doesn't want to understand. When you said okay, you weren't agreeing. You were closing access. You removed them from the list of people whose opinions shape your decisions. You withdrew the resource they didn't know they were depending on. Your continued participation in a narrative that requires your reaction to function. And then you walked away, not to prove a point, not to demonstrate strength, not to win by appearing indifferent. You walked away because you genuinely had somewhere better to be. The conversation ended not because you concluded it with a final statement, but because you removed yourself from the equation entirely. That's not a power move, it's just power. Quiet, complete, and utterly final.